You've been lied to. China isn't holding $3.2 trillion in U.S. assets because they trust the dollar. They're holding it because they're trapped, and if they move wrong, the entire global economy burns. We're talking $731 billion in treasuries, $1.2 trillion in U.S. equities, $500 billion in corporate bonds, $700 billion in pure dollar reserves, and another $200 billion in toxic mortgage-backed securities. Yes, the same ones that detonated in 2008. That's over 18% of China's entire GDP, parked in dollar-denominated assets they can't touch without triggering global financial suicide. This isn't a trade strategy. This isn't economic policy. This is a hostage situation, and no one's getting out clean. You ready to see the real structure of power? Good. Because once you understand the trap, you'll never look at the dollar or China the same way again. 5. You ever wonder what happens when the single biggest factory in the world loses its best customer overnight? Because that's what China's facing. And no one's saying it out loud, but this is the ticking time bomb buried inside their entire economy. The Chinese Communist Party has built its entire growth model on a single pillar: America's willingness to buy. That's not an exaggeration. China's manufacturing juggernaut, the one that pumps out everything from cheap socks to high-end semiconductors, was never about domestic demand. It was about exporting, mostly to the United States. And now, in 2025, that demand is fracturing at the worst possible time. U.S. imports from China have plunged 18.2% year-over-year as of Q3 2025. American companies are decoupling faster than the headlines admit. Apple moved over 35% of iPhone assembly to India and Vietnam in just the last 18 months. Walmart, Target, and Home Depot are sourcing from Mexico, Indonesia, Bangladesh. And it's not just for geopolitical reasons, it's cost. Chinese labor is no longer cheap. Factory wages have risen 132% in the last decade. But here's the kicker. China still holds $3.2 trillion in dollar assets, largely earned from that U.S. export machine. That means even as trade with America shrinks, they're still holding the dollars they earned from it. That's like divorcing your spouse, but still paying the mortgage on their house. Worse, they can't just walk away. Because if they try to sell those dollars to rebalance toward other markets, the dollar crashes, and we already know what happens then. So instead, China is stuck in a loop. They're losing the income stream that created the dollar trap, but they still carry the full weight of that trap on their balance sheet. Imagine building a mansion on top of a volcano, and then losing the fuel that powered your elevators, air conditioning, and water supply. The foundation is still there, but everything else starts shutting down. That's China's export machine right now. They spent 40 years optimizing for U.S. consumer demand. Now they're trying to pivot, but the system isn't built for it. 60% of Chinese manufacturing capacity is export-oriented. Entire cities like Dongguan and Shenzhen exist to serve foreign customers. When those customers disappear, the economic base of those cities dissolves. And the scariest part? Chinese domestic consumption isn't ready to pick up the slack. GDP per capita in China is still only $13,000. That's 1/5 of the U.S. There isn't a deep middle class ready to replace the $500 billion in annual American demand. And even if there were, Chinese consumers are scared. Youth unemployment is 19.6% officially, probably higher. Real estate, where most Chinese families stored their wealth, is down 23% from its 2021 peak. People aren't spending, they're hoarding. So you have this perfect storm: shrinking export income, stagnant domestic demand, and $3.2 trillion in dollar assets that they can't use, can't sell, and can't unwind. It's the financial equivalent of being stuck in a car with a ticking bomb under the seat, and every time they try to move, it ticks faster. This is what analysts miss. It's not just that China can't dump dollars without triggering destruction. It's that the very system that created those dollars is vanishing. The pipeline is drying up. And that means the trap doesn't just hold China in place, it's tightening. Every month that U.S. imports shrink, every factory that moves to Vietnam, every company that retools in Mexico, the trap becomes more permanent. China is not just holding $3.2 trillion worth of American IOUs. They're holding on to a fading dream of the past. And as that dream fades, they're stuck with a balance sheet full of ghosts. Now here's something nobody talks about, because it doesn't show up in headline numbers or flashy charts. It's quiet, technical, but it's the single biggest reason China can't liquidate its dollar reserves even if it wanted to. Ready for this? Global collateral chains. This is where finance gets dark and twisted. Let me explain. When China holds U.S. treasuries, they don't just sit on them like Scrooge McDuck with a vault full of paper. No, they use those treasuries as collateral, as leverage, as instruments in complex global lending structures that power the hidden plumbing of global finance. Treasuries aren't just savings, they're tools, and China is using those tools in every corner of the global dollar system. Here's how it works. Say China's central bank, or one of its massive state-owned banks, wants to fund a project, buy commodities, or underwrite Belt and Road loans in Africa. They post treasuries as collateral to borrow dollars cheaply from European banks, American shadow banks, or offshore money markets in the Cayman Islands. This is called rehypothecation. It means the collateral gets reused multiple times across financial institutions. One $100 million treasury bond can support $400 million in loans across the system. So when you hear that China holds $731 billion in treasuries, what you're not hearing is that maybe $2 trillion in global financing structures are built on top of those same bonds. If China sells those treasuries, that entire chain collapses. Suddenly, dozens of banks and funds can't roll over loans. Margin calls explode, liquidity dries up. It would be like yanking a steel beam out of a skyscraper. Not just the floor above collapses, but the whole tower groans. China knows this. That's why they lease treasuries into repurchase markets. That's why they let their reserves sit in Euroclear accounts in Belgium or Luxembourg. That's why they don't move fast, because those reserves are plugged into the global financial grid like power cables. Unplug them, and the lights go out, and it's not just an external problem. Inside China, this collateral game is the shadow that props up their own banking system. Chinese firms borrow in dollars, and they use government-held treasuries as silent guarantees. It's a daisy chain of hidden leverage. Even Beijing doesn't fully control it anymore. So if they try to sell, they don't just crash the dollar, they detonate their own lending infrastructure. Overnight funding markets seize, Belt and Road projects lose liquidity, commodity supply chains lock up. It's game over. And here's the kicker. This system is opaque. No central database, no full visibility. So even if China wanted to unwind these positions carefully, they'd be flying blind. It's like trying to defuse a bomb with a blindfold on. You don't know which wire triggers the explosion. All you know is that one of them does. So they don't touch the wires. They just sit there holding $3.2 trillion in instruments that look like assets but behave like bombs. This is the dark secret of reserve management. It's not just about value, it's about utility. China can't dump the dollars because the entire system, both foreign and domestic, is wired into them like a nervous system. One cut and everything spasms. That's not a reserve, that's a hostage vest. And they're the ones wearing it. There's a phrase in global finance that most people have never heard, because if they understood it, they'd never sleep again. Dollar liquidity premium. Sounds boring, right? Until you realize this is the invisible force field that makes it impossible for China to ditch the dollar. See, here's what no one tells you. Dollars aren't just a currency. They're oxygen. They are the bloodstream of the global economy. And the reason everyone from oil producers in the Gulf, to shipping firms in Singapore, to lithium miners in Bolivia, holds dollars, uses dollars, borrows dollars, settles contracts in dollars, isn't just because it's tradition. It's because dollars have a liquidity premium that no other currency on earth can match. What does that mean in practice? It means that holding a dollar doesn't just preserve value, it unlocks optionality. You can settle trade, park it in money markets, buy treasuries with it, convert it anywhere, and instantly get financing. It's spendable, swappable, and universally accepted at the drop of a hat. You don't just own a dollar, you own access. Now apply that to China. Because China's $3.2 trillion in dollar exposure isn't just a pile of assets. It's their lifeline to a liquidity system that allows their state-owned banks to stay solvent, their exporters to hedge currency risk, their global infrastructure loans to stay current, and their commodity imports to keep flowing. And if they tried to swap that out for yuan, game over. Because the yuan has no liquidity premium. Zero. The yuan is a managed currency with capital controls, opaque pricing, and limited convertibility. If a central bank in Africa or Latin America tries to offload yuan for euros during a crisis, good luck. There's no depth, no market, no exit ramp. That's why 88% of all global FX transactions involve dollars, not yuan. It's not just preference, it's structure. And here's the horror story most economists don't want to touch. If China unwinds even a fraction of their dollar reserves, they lose access to that liquidity network. Overnight, the market treats them differently. Credit terms tighten, swap lines dry up, sovereign spreads widen, because what the market sees is desperation, and desperation is expensive, and it's already happening. In 2025, China tried to offload $25.7 billion in treasuries in 1 month, the biggest single-month dump in nearly 2 years. And what happened? Interbank lending spreads for Chinese banks widened 40 basis points that quarter. The offshore yuan lost 4% of its value in 2 weeks. It was a warning shot from the market, don't mess with the plumbing. But the most terrifying part? The dollar liquidity network isn't just outside China, it's inside. China imports 10.7 million barrels of oil per day. It pays in dollars. China is the world's largest importer of soybeans, iron ore, semiconductors, all priced in dollars. There's no global supplier on Earth willing to accept yuan at scale unless China foots the FX risk. So if China ditches the dollar, they don't just risk reserve losses, they risk import paralysis. Imagine a superpower that suddenly can't buy energy, food, or tech without paying a 20% risk premium, or worse, not at all. That's not independence, that's economic asphyxiation. And let's not forget debt. Chinese corporations have over $3 trillion in offshore dollar-denominated bonds and loans. Those debts don't magically convert to yuan just because Beijing wants them to. If the dollar becomes scarce because China starts dumping reserves, those debts get harder to refinance. You get defaults, capital flight, and worst of all, contagion. The 1997 Asian financial crisis started because Thailand ran out of dollars to defend its currency peg. Now imagine China doing the same thing, at 50 times the scale. The entire emerging market world would panic. That's the invisible handcuff. China doesn't just need dollars for stability, it needs them for survival. That $3.2 trillion isn't just a position on a spreadsheet, it's their visa to play in the global financial casino. Rip it up, and the bouncers throw them out. That's why they're trapped. Because dollars don't just buy goods, they buy access. And China, for all its posturing, still isn't ready to give that up. Let's talk about the real monster under the bed. Not trade, not liquidity, not even debt. I'm talking about capital flight. And if you think China has control over its money, wait until you see what happens when the elites try to run. Because buried deep in China's financial system is a truth so dangerous, they've made it illegal to talk about. You ready? Here it is. Rich Chinese don't want yuan. They want dollars. And they will do anything to get them, because they know the game is rigged. They know the yuan is manipulated, surveilled, censored, and ultimately worthless in a crisis. The wealthy in China aren't stupid. They see the ghost cities, the debt-to-GDP ratio that officially sits at 84%, but unofficially, when you include shadow debt, hits 300%. They see the collapsing real estate market, where home prices in Tier 3 cities have dropped 37% since 2021. And they're not waiting for the central planners to fix it. They're getting out, quietly, systematically, illegally. In 2025 alone, over $121 billion left China through capital flight mechanisms, most of it disguised through false invoicing, underground banking, crypto exchanges, and overseas education payments. That's just what's trackable. The real number is probably twice that. And here's where it gets diabolical. Every time China dumps dollar reserves, they weaken their ability to defend the currency. That's blood in the water. And the sharks, aka wealthy Chinese with connections, smell it instantly. When Beijing sold $25.7 billion in treasuries in July 2025, capital flight surged 19% the next quarter. Coincidence? Not a chance. Because those elites know the dollar is the exit door. Not Bitcoin, not gold, not Singapore real estate. The dollar. And when the supply of dollars starts to shrink inside China, the demand goes vertical. That's when the dam breaks, and it almost did in 2015. That year, China's currency devalued just 3%, and they lost nearly $1 trillion in reserves defending the yuan. A single minor FX shift cost them almost 25% of their war chest. Why? Because elites panicked. Everyone with access to shadow banking channels tried to convert yuan to dollars before the door slammed shut. Now scale that up to 2025, where the yuan is artificially strong, interest rates are falling, inflation is creeping up, and the real estate market is in shambles. Capital controls have tightened, but so have workarounds. Every Chinese millionaire has a cousin in Vancouver, a shell company in the British Virgin Islands, and a backdoor access to Hong Kong's Forex desks. They're waiting, watching. And if the signal comes, the signal that the dollar is weakening inside China because reserves are being sold, there will be a stampede. Not of tourists, of capital. It will be invisible at first. Crypto volumes will spike. Hong Kong dollar demand will surge. Luxury real estate in California and Australia will sell above list. Then it will hit the data. Banks will run dry. Offshore yuan will trade at a 7%, 8%, 10% discount, and Beijing will have no choice but to burn even more reserves to plug the hole. That's the ultimate irony. The more they try to escape the dollar trap by selling reserves, the more they accelerate the panic that traps them even deeper. It's like trying to put out a fire with gasoline. The elites know the system is fragile, the middle class is catching on, and the central bank is stuck defending a currency nobody actually wants to hold long-term. So they keep holding the $3.2 trillion in dollar assets, not because they love America, but because they fear what happens if they don't. It's not leverage, it's a leash, and it's tightening. You want to know the real reason China can't dump the dollar? Not won't. Can't. Forget trade. Forget liquidity. Forget capital flight. Strip everything away, and it comes down to this. China doesn't control its own financial system. I'm not talking about control in the political sense. I'm not talking about censorship, party influence, or central bank policy. I mean something deeper, something existential. The Chinese financial system is not sovereign. It is externally denominated, externally priced, and externally judged, and it's all priced in dollars. Let me say that again, because most analysts still don't get it. China's economy is denominated in yuan, but its financial system is priced in dollars. That's not just a currency mismatch. That's a systemic vulnerability that no amount of posturing, propaganda, or patriotic consumption can fix. Here's what that looks like in practice. Over 50% of China's largest companies' revenues are tied to dollar-based global demand. Over 60% of their major banks' international lending is dollar-denominated. And 80% of China's sovereign wealth returns are linked to dollar-priced assets. U.S. equities, corporate debt, structured products, even their commodity contracts, oil, copper, rare earth metals are settled in dollars. The yuan may be the legal tender in Shanghai, but the dollar is the gravity that keeps the entire financial solar system from flying apart. Now here's the part that makes your stomach drop. China can't build a replacement fast enough. The cross-border interbank payment system, CKEPS, still only processes about 1.6% of global payments. Yuan-denominated oil contracts with Saudi Arabia? Symbolic, not scalable. The BRICS currency union? A diplomatic hallucination. Nobody wants to hold a currency controlled by a 5-member committee that doesn't even trust each other. China's digital yuan? Surveillance tech, not a reserve asset. Every so-called alternative breaks on the rocks of one brutal fact: trust. The dollar isn't dominant because it's fair. It's dominant because it's trusted. Trusted to clear. Trusted to convert. Trusted to hold value. You might not like the US, but when you wire $10 million across borders, you want that wire to settle. That's the standard. And China, try as it might, has never met that standard. Its capital markets are opaque. Its regulatory regime is arbitrary. Its political interference is legendary. Ask Jack Ma. Ask Evergrande's creditors. Ask the 43 million Chinese retail investors who were told in 2021 that the stock market wasn't a casino, right before Beijing vaporized $1.1 trillion in tech sector value with the stroke of a pen. That's not a reserve system. That's a confidence trap. And here's the horrifying twist. If China sells the dollar, it must price everything in yuan, and no one believes in the yuan. Not even the Chinese. That's why Chinese billionaires keep their wealth in Manhattan condos, Swiss banks, Singapore trusts, and offshore dollar accounts. Because deep down, they know the truth. The dollar system might be flawed, but it's real. The yuan system is performative. It only works as long as everyone agrees to pretend. And if Beijing ever actually moved to dump its dollar reserves in a meaningful way, that illusion collapses instantly. Foreign investors flee. Domestic elites run. Commodities dry up. The bond market implodes. The PBOC prints like mad to cover the gaps. And the whole system, so carefully micromanaged for decades, tears itself apart under the weight of its own contradictions. And this is the final, brutal irony. China spent 40 years trying to become a financial superpower, only to realize they built a house on a foundation they don't own. A financial engine powered by a currency they can't print. An export machine dependent on customers they can't alienate. A saving surplus priced in instruments they can't sell. You want to know what $3.2 trillion really is? It's a mirror. A cruel, glittering mirror that reflects the difference between illusion and power, between control and dependency, between sovereignty and submission. That's why China can't dump the dollar. Because the moment they try, they stop being a financial superpower and become exactly what they've always feared, a regional economy playing on a global stage with someone else's currency, someone else's rules, and someone else's permission. That's the real trap, not just mutual destruction, not just market panic, but the loss of the illusion itself. And once that illusion breaks, it never comes back. China isn't holding $3.2 trillion in dollars because it's a strategic choice. It's a slow-motion financial suicide pact. They can't sell, they can't hold, and they sure as hell can't win. And here's what no one's telling you. When that trap finally snaps, and it will, it won't just hit Beijing or Washington. It'll hit you, your 401k, your mortgage, your food bill, your currency. Because the system holding the world together isn't just cracking, it's rigged to explode. And when the two biggest economies on Earth are both locked in a burning room, holding the same gasoline-soaked dollars, one spark ends the game. Don't blink. Don't wait for the news to tell you. It'll be too late. The collapse has already started. You just haven't felt it yet.